There is a moment. It does not announce itself. It does not arrive with thunder or warning or the decency of explanation. It simply happens, quietly, in the middle of an ordinary afternoon, or in the wreckage of a night you cannot sleep through. And afterward, nothing is ever quite the same again. The moment God goes silent, not absent, not disproven. Silent you prayed, the words left your mouth, and they fell, not upward, not outward, they fell inward, into a kind of hollow where an answer used to live. And you waited, and nothing came. Not comfort, not sign, not the familiar warmth you had known since childhood, that sense of being held by something larger than yourself. Just silence, just you, alone with your own heartbeat, in a universe that suddenly felt several sizes too large. For many people, this is the most terrifying moment of their lives, more terrifying than loss, more destabilizing than grief. Because grief, at least, is accompanied by belief. The belief that something or someone is receiving your sorrow, that your pain matters to a cosmic order that cares. But when God goes silent, you lose not only the comfort, you lose the container for all other suffering, you lose the story, and without the story, you do not know who you are. Carl Jung spent 50 years studying this moment, not from a distance, not from the cold remove of academic inquiry. He studied it because he had lived it. Completely, devastatingly, and ultimately transformatively. And what he found, buried beneath the rubble of every collapsed faith, beneath every midnight where prayer met only silence, was not emptiness, it was an invitation, the most difficult, the most necessary, the most life-altering invitation the human psyche ever extends to itself. Before we go further, if this channel has ever given you a single sentence that named something you could not name yourself, consider subscribing. Hit the bell. Stay close. What comes next in this video will reach places in you that have been waiting a long time to be reached. You were not weak when your faith collapsed. Ride that again. Not quickly. Let it land. You were not weak. You were not faithless. You were not being punished. You were not abandoned by a God who loved others more than he loved you. You were not failing some spiritual test you should have studied harder for. You were being initiated, but no one told you that. No one could tell you that. Because the people around you were just as frightened of the silence as you were. The religious ones told you to pray harder. The secular ones told you it was always an illusion. The well-meaning ones handed you platitudes like thin blankets in a cold room. And the loneliest part was not the silence from God. The loneliest part was the silence from other human beings, the discovery that almost no one had a language for what you were actually going through, because what you were going through was not a crisis of religion. It was a crisis of the self. You had built your identity, your sense of who you were, why you suffered, what your suffering meant, what came after death, whether love was real, whether goodness was rewarded, whether the universe was ordered or chaos. You had built all of that on a foundation called God. And when that foundation began to crack, it was not just your theology that cracked, it was you. The version of you that had made sense of the world through that lens. The version that knew how to pray, knew what to ask for, knew who was listening. The version that could locate itself in a cosmic story, as a child, as a sinner, as a seeker, as a beloved. That version began to dissolve. And in its place came something that had no name yet. Something raw. Something frightening. Something that felt like falling with no ground beneath you. That feeling was not the end, Jung would tell you, and spend his career demonstrating that it was, in fact, the beginning of what he called individuation, the deep, slow, irreversible process by which a human being stops living from the outside in, from borrowed beliefs, inherited images, external authorities, and begins, for the first time, to live from the inside out from the self. But that word, that concept, that destination, is reached only through the darkness. And the darkness begins precisely where you are. In the moment the old God falls silent. Jung made a distinction that almost no one in the modern world has heard of, and yet it changes everything. He distinguished between God, whatever ultimate reality that word points toward, and what he called the God image. The psychological representation of the divine that each human being carries inside the psyche. The God image is not God, it is the picture of God. The internalized portrait built from childhood, from family, from culture, from every prayer answered and every prayer ignored, from every moment of grace and every moment of devastation. It is shaped by your first experience of your father's voice, whether it was tender or terrifying. It is shaped by the church you sat in or didn't, by the stories you were handed before you were old enough to question them, by the face of suffering, and whether anyone ever explained it to you in a way that made sense. The God image lives in the psyche. It is, in Jung's understanding, one of the most powerful organizing forces in the entire inner world. It gives meaning to suffering. It provides a structure for morality. It creates a narrative. You are here. You came from there. You are going toward this, that the ego desperately needs in order to function. And for much of a human life, the God image works. It holds. It comforts. It organizes. It explains. Until it doesn't, because the God image, no matter how sincerely constructed, no matter how devoutly maintained, is still a psychological structure. And psychological structures, Jung understood, have a lifespan. They serve the development of the self up to a certain point. And then they become the very walls that prevent the self from growing further. When you were a child, the God image you received was appropriate for a child. It offered safety. It offered the sense of being watched over, cared for, protected. It offered the comfort of a loving parent who sees all and provides all and intervenes when called. But you are not a child anymore. You have lived. You have suffered in ways that a protecting parent God cannot explain. You have lost people who did not deserve to be lost. You have seen injustice that a just God cannot have ordered. You have prayed with everything you had and received. In return, nothing, or worse than nothing, more suffering. And the God image, built for a child's psyche, cannot hold the weight of an adult's experience. It was never supposed to. This is not a failure of faith. This is not the result of insufficient devotion. This is, in Jung's framework, the natural and necessary evolution of the soul. The God image must die so that something truer can be born. And here is the terrible mercy of it. The psyche orchestrates this death itself, not as punishment, as surgery. The alchemists of the medieval world, those strange obsessive men hunched over their furnaces and their manuscripts, were not, Jung believed, merely trying to turn lead into gold. They were, in their symbolic and externalized way, describing the process of psychological transformation, the transformation of the soul, and that process begins, always, with what they called Nigredo, the blackening, the stage of dissolution, of putrefaction, of the complete breakdown of what was previously solid. In the alchemical vessel, the prima materia, the raw, unprocessed material, had first to be reduced to nothing, burned, dissolved, turned black and formless and seemingly dead. Only then could the next stage begin. Jung recognized, with the eyes of a depth psychologist, that Nigredo was not merely a metaphor for chemistry. It was a description of the soul's experience at the threshold of transformation. The blackening is what you enter when the old structure collapses, when the old God falls silent, when the narrative that organized your life dissolves and you are left with nothing. No story, no framework, no answer to the simplest and most devastating questions. Why am I suffering? Does my life mean anything? Is there anyone listening? That void, that terrible, yawning, featureless void, is Nigredo. It is not depression in the clinical sense, though it can look like depression. It is not atheism, though it can feel like atheism. It is not despair, though despair is one of its textures. It is the necessary darkness between two forms of light, between the light of the borrowed God, the one received from outside, from family and culture and tradition, and the light of the discovered God, the one encountered in the depths of the self, through lived experience, through the confrontation with one's own soul. But you cannot know, while you are inside the Nigredo, that it will end. That is the terror of it. You cannot see forward. You cannot see what the dissolution is preparing you for. You can only experience the dissolution itself, the falling away of everything that once made sense, the collapse of every certainty you had used to orient yourself in the world. Many people, at this stage, make one of two fatal errors. The first is to retreat, to run back into the old structure with fresh urgency, to pray harder, attend more services, read more scripture, perform more devotion, to try to rebuild, through sheer force of will, the God image that has already begun to crumble. This path does not lead back to genuine faith. It leads to rigidity, to fundamentalism, to a kind of psychological armoring that keeps the darkness out, but also keeps all genuine growth out with it. The second error is to declare the darkness permanent, to conclude, from the silence, that there was never anything there, that the God image was always an illusion, and the mature response is to discard it entirely and proceed with the practical business of a life stripped of the transcendent. This path does not lead to liberation. It leads to a different kind of poverty, the poverty of a psyche that has amputated its own deepest dimension, that has silenced its own most urgent longings in the name of rationality. Jung's path, the path of individuation, requires something far more difficult than either retreat or dismissal. It requires descent, conscious, willing, terrified descent into the darkness. Not because the darkness is where you live, but because the darkness is where the gold is buried. Pay attention to what you dream when God falls silent. The psyche does not go quiet just because the ego has lost its map. The unconscious continues its ancient, tireless work, producing images, weaving symbols, staging small dramas in the theater of sleep that carry messages the waking mind is not yet equipped to receive. And among the most common dreams that accompany the collapse of the God image, documented across cultures, across centuries, across the case files of Jungian analysts from Zurich to New York to Sao Paulo, are a specific cluster of images, the empty church. You stand inside it. The building is intact, the architecture, the pews, the altar, but the space has the quality of a ruin. No one else is present. The light comes through the windows at a strange angle, as if it is the light of late afternoon on a day that has been ending for a very long time. And the altar, which should hold the most sacred object in your particular tradition, holds nothing, or holds something you cannot quite make out. Something wrapped, or absent, or replaced by an object that should not be there. This dream does not mean your faith was false. It means the form your faith has taken is being cleared away to make room for something it cannot contain, the descending staircase. You are moving downward, not falling, walking deliberately into the earth. Below a house, below a city, below any structure you recognize. The staircase goes further than seems possible, and at some point you realize you are not afraid. Or you were afraid, and the fear has transformed into something else. A kind of terrible curiosity, a pull that is stronger than the instinct to stop. In Jungian dream analysis, the descent is the journey into the unconscious. The psyche is guiding the dreamer downward, toward what has been buried, toward the shadow material, toward the unlived life, toward the archetypal depths where the self resides beneath all the layers of persona and adaptation, the figure at the threshold, an old man, a cloaked woman, a stranger whose face you cannot see but whose presence carries enormous weight. They stand between you and wherever you are going. They do not block you. They simply require you to see them, to acknowledge their presence, to pass through them rather than around them. This is the threshold guardian, the archetype that appears at every genuine threshold of transformation. In mythology, it is the ferryman who requires payment before crossing the river of the dead. It is the Sphinx who asks the question you must answer correctly. It is the elder at the edge of the village who must be greeted before you enter the wilderness. In the dreams of a person whose God image is dying, this figure often carries the old faith itself, not as an enemy, but as a gate. You must encounter it. You must honor what it gave you, understand what it cost you, and then, with grief, with gratitude, with the respect owed to any form that served its purpose, you must walk through the fire, not always destructive. Sometimes simply present, a fire in the center of a room, or at the center of a forest, or inside a vessel, burning but not consuming. The alchemists called this the ignis in naturalis, the unnatural fire, the fire that purifies without destroying. In dreams, this fire is the self in its transformative aspect, the burning away of what no longer serves, the preparation of the psyche for a new and more authentic form. Do not fear the fire in your dreams. It is not punishment. It is preparation. William James, whose work Jung read carefully and respected deeply, identified two fundamental types of religious and psychological experience. The once-born soul moves through life in relative coherence. Its original framework holds. It finds meaning in the tradition it inherited. It does not experience the particular kind of shattering that forces reconstruction from the ground up. It is not a lesser soul. It is simply a differently constituted one. Its road is smoother. Its darkness is of a different kind, and then there is the twice-born, the soul that was formed in one way, given one set of answers, one framework, one story, and then shattered, completely agonizingly shattered. Not cracked, shattered, and then from the fragments of the first form, rebuilt into something new. Not restored, not repaired, rebuilt, with a different architecture, a different relationship to certainty. A different and far more hard-won understanding of what it means to live in a universe where suffering is real, and the old answers are not sufficient. Jung was twice born. In his autobiography, Memories, Dreams, Reflections, he describes a childhood experience of such psychological intensity that it left him permanently separated from the comfortable, inherited faith of his pastor father. He had a vision, a terrifying, ecstatic, shattering vision that he spent years unable to speak about to anyone, because the vision seemed to contradict everything his family believed, everything the church taught, everything a good Swiss pastor's son was supposed to think and feel and imagine. He was perhaps 12 years old. He was walking home from school, past the cathedral in Basel. The sun was shining. The world was beautiful. And into that ordinary afternoon descended an image so disturbing, so unprecedented, so utterly uninvited, that he spent 3 days in agony, suppressing it before finally, trembling, allowing himself to think it through to its conclusion. The image involved God, and it involved destruction, and it changed everything. He never became an atheist. He never abandoned the transcendent. But from that moment forward, he could not return to the God of his childhood. That God was gone. And in God's place, or rather, beneath the collapsed image, something was waiting that would take him a lifetime to begin to understand. That journey, from the collapse of the received God image to the discovery of what Jung called the self, the deepest organizing center of the psyche, which carries within it all the characteristics that religion has historically attributed to God. That journey is the journey of the twice-born, and it is your journey. If you are watching this, not because you chose it, you did not choose it. The twice-born rarely choose their shattering. It is chosen for them by something in the depths of the psyche that has determined that the first form has served its purpose and must now give way to something larger. The tragedy is that it feels like loss. The gift, invisible during the Nigredo, only visible in retrospect, is that it is expansion. Here is something that almost no one is willing to say, not from pulpits, not in therapy offices, not in spiritual communities, about the collapse of the God image. Sometimes the God image had to die because it was carrying the shadow. Jung's concept of the shadow is among the most important and most consistently misunderstood ideas in his entire body of work. The shadow is not simply the dark side of the personality. The anger, the envy, the sexuality, the aggression. The shadow is everything that has been exiled from conscious identity. Everything that the ego has decided does not belong to its self-portrait. And for people raised in religious traditions with a powerful moral framework, the shadow tends to be enormous. Because the more clearly a tradition defines goodness, the more precisely it delineates what a righteous person thinks, feels, desires, does, the more material it hands the shadow to work with. The anger that a good Christian should not feel, the doubt that a faithful Muslim must suppress, the grief that a believing soul must transmute into acceptance before it has been fully felt, the sexuality that must be managed, controlled, elevated, sublimated, the rage at God for the deaths of children, for the suffering of the innocent, for the silence that came when the prayer was most desperate. That rage, which feels like blasphemy, which cannot be admitted even to oneself, all of that goes into the shadow, and the shadow does not disappear. It accumulates. It pressurizes. It finds its way into the body as illness, into relationships as incomprehensible cruelty, into dreams as monsters and abysses and fires that the dreamer does not recognize as their own. And at some point, because the psyche is relentlessly committed to wholeness in a way that the ego never is, the shadow erupts. And it erupts, often precisely at the site of the God image. Because the God image has been the mechanism of suppression, the framework that explained why all of that shadow material had to be denied. The authority that demanded the exile of so much authentic human experience in the name of righteousness. When the God image collapses, the shadow comes with it. All of it. The denied anger, the suppressed doubt, the unexpressed grief, the crucified sexuality, the rage that was never allowed to be rage. This is terrifying. It feels like evidence of spiritual failure. It feels like proof that the darkness was always there beneath the faith, that the faith was always a cover for something corrupt. It is not. It is the shadow returning from exile to be integrated, to be seen, to be held, to be transformed from an unconscious force that controls behavior into a conscious element of a whole and complex human being. Jung called this shadow integration the first and most essential stage of individuation. You cannot move toward the self, toward the deepest, most authentic center of your being, while you are carrying a shadow the size of a mountain that you have never looked at directly. The collapse of the God image is often the moment the shadow is finally forced into the light, not because God was the enemy, but because the image, the structure, had become too small to contain the full truth of who you are. There is an archetype awakening in you, not a metaphor, not a poetic flourish, an actual, living, autonomous force in the deeper layers of the psyche, one that has been moving beneath the surface of your life for longer than you realize, orchestrating events and experiences and crises precisely toward this moment. It is the archetype of the twice-born seeker. In every mythological tradition across every culture that has left its stories behind in stone or manuscript or song, there is this figure, the one who was formed in one world and destroyed in it, the one who descended into the earth, into the sea, into the underworld, into madness, into the wilderness, and who returned changed, permanently, irreversibly changed, carrying something that could not have been found without the descent. Osiris, dismembered and scattered across the earth, reassembled piece by piece into a new and more powerful form. Inanna, the Sumerian queen of heaven, who descended into the underworld naked, stripped of every crown and jewel and garment, and who returned, changed, deeper, carrying the knowledge of death and therefore fully able to understand life. Jonah, swallowed by the darkness, 3 days in the belly of something vast and incomprehensible, and then cast out onto the shore of a new beginning he had not chosen and could not have imagined. Perhaps the most psychologically sophisticated figure in the entire Hebrew Bible, the man who prayed correctly, lived righteously, and was nevertheless delivered to suffering, who confronted God with his complaint and received, in return, not an explanation, but an encounter, not an answer, but a presence so vast and so wild that the question itself was transformed. Job did not get his questions answered. He got himself transformed. This is the movement of the archetype. This is what it does. It does not deliver resolution. It does not hand you a new and tidier God image to replace the old one. It does not provide certainty in place of the certainty that was destroyed. It provides depth. It provides the kind of faith that can only be built from the inside, that has been tested by the actual fires of a real life, not the theoretical fires of a tradition someone else survived. The twice-born seeker carries a knowledge that the once-born never possess, the knowledge that the structures we build around the sacred are not the sacred itself, that the map is not the territory, that the finger pointing at the moon is not the moon, and paradoxically, and this is the great paradox of the twice-born journey, having lost the God image, the twice-born often arrives at a deeper, more intimate, more unshakable relationship with the living mystery than any inherited faith ever provided. Not because the collapse was good. It was not good. It was terrible. But because what was buried beneath the collapse was something that could only be reached through the collapse. The alchemical process does not end with Nigredo. After the blackening comes the albedo, the whitening. This is the stage Jung associated with reflection, with the first emergence of the new self from the dissolution of the old. It is not yet completion. That comes later with the Rubedo, the reddening, the full incarnation of the transformed personality. The albedo is more fragile than that, more tentative. It is the moment when, in the deepest darkness, something like a small, cold, quiet light becomes visible. Not the light you remember, not the warmth of the old God image, with its familiar prayers and its known comforts. Something different, something more austere, more precise, more demanding, but also, somehow, more real. It often arrives first not as belief, but as experience. A moment in nature, sudden, unbidden, overwhelming, where the distinction between self and world becomes, for an instant, porous, where something that has no name communicates directly with something in you that also has no name, a synchronicity. The specific kind of meaningful coincidence that Jung spent decades studying, not as supernatural intervention, but as a manifestation of the deeper ordering principle of the psyche. You think of someone long absent. They call. You are walking through the worst morning of your grief, and a stranger speaks to you the exact words you needed to hear. You open a book at random, and your eyes fall on the exact sentence that addresses the exact question you have been carrying. These are not accidents. They are communications from the self, the deeper center, which is attempting to make contact with the ego through the language of meaningful coincidence, a dream that shifts in quality. Not the heavy, oppressive, anxious dreams of the Nigredo, but something different. A dream in which light appears from an unexpected direction. A dream in which a figure you have never seen before offers something, a gift, a hand, a word. A dream in which you arrive somewhere after a long journey you do not remember beginning and recognize it as home. These are the signs of albedo, of the beginning of the reformation. But the albedo requires something of the ego that the Nigredo made almost impossible. It requires honesty, not the performed honesty of confession, not the strategic honesty of self-improvement, the raw, unglamorous, frightening honesty of a person who has been stripped of every layer of protection and is seeing themselves, perhaps for the first time, without the organizing fiction of the God image to edit the view. Who am I when I am not what I was taught to be? What do I actually believe, not what I was handed, not what I have been performing, not what comforts the people around me, but what I have found to be true in the bones of my own lived experience. What is sacred to me, not theoretically, but actually, in the moments of my life that have been most real, most vivid, most indelibly marked? These questions are the work of Albedo, and they are slow work. The answers do not arrive as intellectual propositions. They arrive as lived experience accumulated over years, gradually composing themselves into something that functions as a new and more authentically personal faith. Jung wrote, in one of the most extraordinary sentences in the history of psychology, that he did not need to believe in God. He knew he was not speaking of certainty in the intellectual sense. He was not claiming philosophical proof. He was speaking of direct, psychological, experiential encounter with the numinous, with the archetype of the divine as it manifests in the depths of the psyche. In his late work, particularly in answer to Job, which is perhaps the most courageous book ever written by a psychologist, Jung argued something that shocked the religious and the academic worlds in equal measure. That God, as encountered in the psyche, is not a simple, all-good, all-knowing being of perfect love. The God of the unconscious, the living God, the numinous force that erupts through the depths of the human soul, is wild, is contradictory, contains both light and darkness, both creation and destruction, both love and devastation. Job already knew this. He had experienced it firsthand. The God who allowed, even orchestrated, his suffering was not the God he had been taught to pray to, but the God who spoke from the whirlwind, the God who asked, "Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth?" That God was, in Job's direct experience, undeniably real. And Jung's reading of Job is that this confrontation, this encounter with the full, terrifying, magnificent, incomprehensible reality of the divine, was not a punishment. It was an elevation. Job was raised to a new level of consciousness precisely because he refused to lie about his experience. He refused to do what his friends urged, to explain away his suffering, to rationalize the silence, to maintain the appearance of a God image that his actual life had already disproven. He told the truth. He said, "What has happened to me cannot be reconciled with the God I was taught to worship. I demand an encounter with the actual God, not the image, not the theology. The actual and the actual came, and it was not comfortable, and it was not explicable, and it did not answer his questions, but it was real, in a way that nothing before had been real. This is the God that awaits on the other side of the collapsed God image, not a gentler version of the childhood picture, not a philosophical concept, not a consoling metaphor. Something living. Something that meets you in the depths of your own psyche, in the dream, in the synchronicity, in the moment of absolute stillness where you stop performing and simply are, and communicates with a directness that leaves no room for doubt, not the doubt-destroying certainty of dogma, the doubt-irrelevant certainty of direct experience. The third stage of the alchemical process, the stage Jung associated with the completion of individuation, is the rubedo, the reddening, the color of blood, of incarnation, of the full, warm, embodied life of a human being who has descended into the depths and returned, not transcendent, not floating above the world in some rarefied spiritual accomplishment, but more fully human, more completely present, more genuinely alive in the texture of ordinary experience than they have ever been before. This is the paradox that all the great mystical traditions know and that modern spirituality consistently obscures. The goal of the inner journey is not escape from the world. It is return to it, transformed. The individuated soul does not live differently in terms of external circumstances. It may still face loss, it will certainly face death, it will continue to encounter suffering, disappointment, the grinding, ordinary difficulties of a finite life in an imperfect world, but it faces all of it differently, because it no longer requires the world to conform to a framework it inherited, because it has built, through its own descent and return, a relationship with the living center of the psyche, the self, that can hold the contradictions of existence without fracturing. The individuated soul has a different relationship with suffering, not a better tolerance for it, a different understanding of it. Having passed through the Nigredo, having survived the dissolution that felt like permanent death, the individuated soul knows something about suffering that cannot be taught. It knows that suffering, when fully entered and endured and integrated, transforms. Not immediately, not comfortably, not on any timeline the ego would prefer, but it transforms. The wound becomes the wound that heals others. This is the Chiron archetype, the wounded healer of Greek mythology, the centaur who could not heal his own wound, but whose wound became the source of his healing power for everyone else. The suffering you have endured, the specific, unrepeatable, particular shape of your darkness, is not wasted. It is not random. It is, in the deepest Jungian understanding, the very credential of your future usefulness to the world. You cannot give to others what you have not first survived yourself. The individuated soul has a different relationship with God. Not the God image, that picture still lies in fragments, and the individuated soul does not mourn it, though it may sometimes feel the ghost of the warmth it once provided. The living God, the numinous center that speaks through dream and synchronicity, and the inexplicable moments of encounter that no materialist philosophy has ever satisfactorily explained. This God asks more of you than the God image ever did. The God image asked for compliance, for adherence to prescribed behaviors and beliefs, for the performance of righteousness. The living God asks for consciousness, for the willingness to see yourself clearly in your light and in your shadow, and to take responsibility for the full truth of who you are, for the courage to live from your own deepest center rather than from the expectations of others. This God is harder to satisfy, and infinitely more satisfying. There is a sentence that has been building through everything said in this video. A sentence for the one who has been sitting in the rubble of a faith that used to hold them. For the one who has prayed into silence and waited for an answer that did not come in the form they expected. For the one who is somewhere between the God they lost and the God they have not yet found, suspended in the between, which is the most terrifying and the most sacred place a human being can inhabit. The God you lost was never God. It was a picture of God, and the psyche had to destroy it so something real could live. The picture was not worthless. It served you. It carried you through the years when you needed carrying. It gave shape and warmth and story to a life that might otherwise have had none. You are not required to hate it for its insufficiency, but you are required, by the deepest imperative of your own soul, to let it go, and in the letting go, to discover what was always beneath it, the living mystery, the God that does not fit in any image, the self. You are not where you are by accident, the collapse you have lived through. Whatever form it took, however specific its contours, however personal its devastation, was not a failure. It was a threshold. And the fact that you are still here, still asking questions, still willing to sit with the discomfort of not knowing, still seeking something truer than what you were given, that is not weakness. That is the single most courageous thing a human being can do. Most people, when the old structure begins to crack, run back to certainty or forward into numbness. The people who stay, who remain in the dissolution, who endure the blackening, who do not flinch from the terrible work of rebuilding the self from the inside out, those people are rare. You are rare. Jung spent his life in service to that rarity. Not because it was comfortable, not because it was rewarded by the institutions and authorities of his time. He did it because he had been through the darkness himself, because he knew, from the inside, what it cost. And because he knew, also from the inside, what it yielded, a life that is genuinely yours. A faith that has been tested by fire and found to be, beneath the ash, unburnable. A relationship with the deepest center of your being, the self, that no external authority can grant or revoke, because you built it yourself in the darkness when you had no other tools. This is what awaits on the other side of the collapsed God image. Not certainty, not comfort, not the return of the warmth you remember. Something better than warmth. Depth.